Hello and welcome to a special edition of Word Mentality from Grammar&Thongs. Normally on Word Mentality we look at the origin of words or the etymology of a word that's unusual, and in the hope that it might help you use it correctly or spell it correctly in the future. But today we're looking at an unusual place name, and it'll be of particular interest to people living in the Illawarra, particularly those living in suburbs north of Wollongong, because we're looking at the suburb name Fairy Meadow, which is an unusual place name, so I thought it would be worth exploring the story behind it. If you look at local history books or look it up online, you'll find Fairy Meadow described, when it was named, as a grassed open meadowlands with a stream of fresh water running through it, noted for its fairy-like beauty. And so that seems to be the explanation for the name. It was a place that was so beautiful you could imagine fairies living there. So it was a fairy meadow. But if you consider that it was also once known as Parameadow or Parameadows, then you start to wonder, is that all there is to the story? The word para in Aboriginal languages, because remember, there were people living in this area a long time before it was called Fairy Meadow. The Darawal people have been living in the Illawarra for thousands of years. And the word para means river or creek. If you think of another place name being Parramatta, there's some confusion over the exact origin of that word, like with a lot of Aboriginal place names if they came from an oral tradition. But generally it's agreed that Parramatta means either the head of the sort of headwaters where the river started, or the meeting place for eels, where eels lay down, as in where they would go to breed. But para can mean river. And so perhaps Fairy Meadow was originally called Parameadows because it was a place where the river ran through. And that still goes with this story, that it was a beautiful place, and so Parameadow then became Fairy Meadow over time. If you look at the names of the train station at Fairy Meadow, it has actually had 4 different names over the years. Originally, it was called Cramsville, and that was in 1887 until a year later it became Parameadows in 1888, and then in 1909 it was known as Balgownie, which is the suburb to the west of Fairy Meadow, until finally it wasn't until 1956 that the station actually got its name Fairy Meadow, which is what it's still known as today. Cramsville was named after a man by the last name Cram, who owned the land and built some small houses and established a settlement there. So you can see it's had a lot of different names throughout the years until it finally became Fairy Meadow. So for me, the last piece of the puzzle is if you go a bit further back. If you go back to about 1824, you find a record of a sale of land under the name Fairy Meadow. Now, Fairy to me sounds like the name of somebody, and it's a bit hard to establish what happened going further back or who that person Fairy might have been, but I think it's easy to imagine that there was somebody called Fairy and this was Fairy's Meadow. And so over the years Fairy's Meadow became known as Fairy Meadow, and then Fairy Meadow easily could become Fairy Meadow just through, frequency of use by people. So this story here about a magical land of fairy-like beauty is a much more attractive one, and there may be some truth to it. But as with most stories of word origin or etymology, usually the more accurate story is the slightly less interesting one, that being that it was originally Fairy or Fairy's Meadow, which then became Fairy Meadow. Thank you.